So in this lesson, I'd like to talk about tariffs and quotas. Before when we discussed the idea of international trade, we noted that if a country faced a lower world price than the domestic equilibrium price, it was likely that there would be some form of imports that would come in to satisfy the increased demand. Now, in that case, there's going to be some negative effects of those imports. One of those negative effects is going to be that domestic production will drop. There'll be lost jobs in that country. Consumers, however, will be quite excited by the ability to access more goods and services at lower prices. Now, politicians can react in a number of ways to this. They can either prioritize the socioeconomic benefit to consumers, or they may be more concerned about the potential negative effects that have occurred with the production in the industry that is experiencing those that competitive the competition against a producer with a lower opportunity cost. So politicians can react in a couple of different ways. One of those is to apply a tariff. Now, a tariff is essentially an excise tax on imported goods. There's two basic types. The first is a pure revenue tariff. It exists only to produce revenue for the government. And the reason that it's called a revenue tariff is that we are assuming that there's no domestic competition. In other words, it's not produced domestically. There's another type of tariff, which is a protective tariff. That tariff is produced primarily to protect domestic industries. While both tariffs produce revenue for the government, the reasons that they would be implemented are different. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, at what cost does that protection come? So let's have a look at the scenario. First of all, when we think about tariffs, when you write the AP exam, you're going to need to be able to understand and be able to explain the effects of tariffs. You'll also need to be able to contrast their performance to the performance and impacts of a quota, which we'll discuss in a following lesson. Firstly, we'll explain the logic of this to follow, but firstly, you note that when a tariff is implemented, domestic consumers pay higher prices and will consume less of the goods. Trade becomes less efficient. The reason for that is that we essentially are shifting trade from the highest efficiency producers to the less efficient domestic producers. So overall, we see a loss of efficiency in the trade system. An interesting point is that the tariff revenue or taxation revenue will end up in the government pockets. And that's interesting to politicians, of course, and that is one of the primary ways that a tariff differs from a quota. Compared to the free trade scenario where we let people completely trade, domestic producers will in fact increase their output. The higher price allows them to have a higher production point. Imports will decline. And the reason for that is that those higher prices mean that a greater proportion of the domestic demand will be satisfied by domestic producers. It's interesting to note that societal welfare is lost, and this relates to the loss in efficiency of trade. But essentially, consumer surplus is lost, and of course, there's a deadweight loss that now exists. We'll identify that area graphically, and you'll need to be able to do that on the AP exam as well. So let's start and see if we can understand this. We'll look at the first situation, which is that we have no international trade. This is a standard supply and demand system that you would have seen many times before now. And when we see those supply and demand curves, we say, all right, we can expect that, with no competitive pressure, domestic producers and consumers are going to find some equilibrium point that makes sense. It's obviously at the intersection of those two curves, and we see a P equilibrium and a Q equilibrium when there's no trade being taking place. Okay, so we've seen this graph before. Let's see what happens. Another point to make is that domestic producers will provide all goods and services at the quantity QD, no trade. Okay? All right. Now, what we're going to do is take that same graph and we're going to add to it an international producer that has a comparative advantage in producing that good. Now, we'll assume for our purposes that the the goods are indistinguishable. In other words, that the quality and the attractiveness of those goods is similar. So price is the real competitive point that we're seeing. Now at that world price, that low world price, it we're going to see some effects here on our market. I should point out that that low price implies that the supply curve for the world is essentially to the left or down, excuse me, to the right or below the domestic supply curve. In other words, they have a comparative advantage. They're able and willing to provide more goods and services at a lower price than our domestic producers. So we have the situation where world producers are more efficient than our domestic producers. It looks to me like, as we discussed before, domestic production is going to drop from this point, QD no trade, in other words, the previous equilibrium point, down to the QP no trade. That's the amount produced when trade is introduced. Essentially, the effect is the decreased price has caused the domestic production point to slide down the curve to the point where it meets or intersects that world price. Now, at that point, we can see, following the price line across, that the intersection with the domestic demand curve is well to the right of the QD no trade point. What that means that at that lower price, domestic consumers now want an increased amount QD trade. Okay, and we can see that the quantity demanded during trade, this point here, is significantly greater than the quantity being produced at that same low price. Now, there's going to be a shortage that would exist, and that shortage, the difference between QD trade and QP trade, will be satisfied with imports. And so foreign producers are essentially producing that value of goods. So, politicians might react by saying, oh, we've lost some production capacity, our workers are being hurt. This will undoubtedly play itself out in the press and in political circles. And they could react by saying, all right, well, what we're going to do is we've decided that we're going to prioritize the needs of production resources over the needs of the consumers in our supply and demand system. What they could do is write a law to impose a tariff, which is a tax. And essentially what that tax will do is that will cause the world supply curve to shift to the left or decrease, as the costs are imposed upon them, these costs are the cost of the tax. You can see that new supply curve, the one shown in red, is the one that's been shifted to the left by those increased taxes. Now, that is going to cause the world price with the tariff imposed to actually rise to the intersection point of the demand side of the demand curve, the domestic demand curve. Also, imports will now drop. You can see that the amount, first of all, that happens for two reasons. The first of which is that the quantity demanded by trade will drop to the quantity demanded under tariff at that higher price, which is at the intersection of the new higher world price and the domestic demand curve. On the other side of the equation, the amount that domestic producers are willing to produce will slide up the curve here and also to the right, and you'll see that the quantity produced under the tariff at that higher world price will be greater than the production amount that was produced when we had free and unfettered trade. So the difference here is this shortage is now less than it was, and therefore the amount that is imported is less. So domestic production rises, just to summarize, from the point QP trade to QP tariff, and domestic consumption drops from QD trade to QD tariff, and the D is for demand. All right. There's a couple of other implications, one of which has to do with societal welfare, which you may remember from a previous lesson. First of all, we'll go back to the initial state of the supply and demand curve when we had no trade at all. You may remember that societal welfare is essentially the area between the demand curve and the supply curve to the left of the equilibrium point. Now, when we get that unfettered trade, we get an additional area of societal welfare. Think of societal welfare as the goodness that returns to consumers that were willing to pay a higher price, but did not have to pay that price. Um, Now, there's been some transfer of surplus here, but perhaps the most important point is that there's new consumer surplus, which is derived, and that new consumer surplus is the triangle that exists below the equilibrium point and from the right down to the world price between the quantity that is willing to be demand or produced by our domestic producers, and the amount that would be provided by our um, foreign producers. So this red area is the new additional consumer surplus that will accrue to the domestic consumer. This is kind of a graphical way of saying how much happier those consumers are that they have access to more goods at a lower price. Now, when we impose a government tariff, that we're going to see some lost societal welfare, and we're going to see some shifting of money within our socioeconomic system. So we'll just get the graph set up here. We see that the supply curve, the world supply curve, has been shifted upwards and to the left by the tariff that was imposed. It's interesting to note that the tariff would be applied only on those imported goods. So essentially, this green shaded area here, the area between the amount that domestic producers are willing to produce, the domestic producers produce from zero all the way up to this point. The rest of this goods are provided by foreign producers. And so this is the amount here, the distance between those 2 points, horizontal distance between those 2 points that's being imported. Now, if you look at the difference in price of the product, where between the old world price, that lower one, and the new one under the tariff, that difference in price is essentially the tax that's being imposed. So if you take that difference in price, that vertical difference in price, and multiply it times those amount of goods, it represents a dollar value that is essentially put into the pockets of the government. That's a consumer surplus, which is not received by consumers, nor is it received by producers. In fact, it's gone to a third party, and acts as an externality in the supply system with this money going off into the hands of the government. There's also some other areas here, and the red areas represent the deadweight loss, which is lost value to society or value that's been taken away from both producers and consumers. Uh, there's another note to be made here. Remember that when we were at the low world price, we had this large horizontal distance here that represented the amount of imports that were being um, brought into the country. Now that we've only got a small amount of imports, you can see that some production has been moved to domestic producers. And now that production, the difference between QP trade and QP tariff, this distance here, is production that was moved from a highly efficient producer to a less efficient producer. In other words, we have undermined the overall efficiency of the world trading system. So remember those 3 points. The green area shaded represents the value of the tax that is taken away from producers and the government. The red areas represent the deadweight loss, and then also the point that the overall trade has become less efficient. Summary, here's a quick summary of the effects of tariffs. This is the same slide we showed before. Domestic consumers are going to pay higher prices, and they will consume less goods and services. This essentially means that their quality of life has been diminished if we can assume that the quality of life correlates to the amount of goods and services that people are able to consume. Their wealth, if you will. Overall world trade's less efficient. Tariff revenue goes to the government. The reason that this entry here is noted in red is because this is one of the primary differences between a tariff and a quota. We're going to see that when we have a quota, we'll discuss it in our next lesson, but the tariff, there is no revenue that goes to the government, but instead it ends up in the hands of foreign producers. And again, compared to free trade, domestic producers increase their output. The reason for that is that they now face a higher price that makes it more profitable for them to produce more in the market. And of course, imports decline. So looks like foreign producers are losing a little bit with this tariff. Uh, Again, societal welfare, consumer surplus is lost. In other words, dead weight loss now exists. In our next lesson, we'll talk about quotas, and we'll contrast how quotas work and what the difference in effect is compared to those to the tariffs that we just covered.